Excuse me, if you folks could be kind enough to find your seats, we'll reconvene in the interests of keeping on schedule. Picky, 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 that's true. No, don't fight, boys. Be nice. Play nice. At the risk of misspeaking, I'm going to try to tell you what little I know about Bob Anderson. I also met Bob at the same time I met Edmund Opitz at the seminar in January in South Carolina. And those of you who've been following FEE's activities know that Mr. Leonard Reed passed away last year. And at that time, the traces were, the day-to-day management traces, I guess, were picked up by Bob Anderson. And Bob is with us this morning to deliver a message called The Barriers to Freedom, of which there are many. And hopefully Bob will be able to give us some insights into how to hurdle those barriers. So let me at this time introduce Mr. Robert Anderson.
Well, thank you, Dick. And I hope you folks have all had lots of coffee. You're going to need it. I'm not here to give you the answers. My function is to give you the problems. And I love to talk about problems. I love to talk about anything that'll upset you. It's just a natural trait of mine. Around the foundation, everybody says of me, you know, Anderson, if there's a seamy side to anything, you're going to find it. And I do. It's just kind of fun. Cheer you up and get you all enthusiastic about this subject. We'll leave that to Carson and Opitz. Me, I'm here for a quite different purpose. It used to be, and you folks down here in the South can appreciate this, it used to be that if you wanted to scare the devil out of folks, what you did is you went out and you threw some sawdust on the ground, you put up a tent, and you got yourself one of these fire and brimstone preachers, and then he'd have at you. And he did a pretty good job of it. He'd scare the devil out of you. But that doesn't work anymore. That's kind of passé. Now, if you want to scare the hell out of people, what you do is you go out and get yourself an economist to talk about the state of affairs in our present economy, and it works. One of my favorite stories that I've been telling for 1,000 years, because in a way it explains why I feel an obligation to pass out cyanide capsules at the end of one of my lectures, is that I'm kind of like the, in terms of what I have to say, I'm kind of like the fellow that was at the deathbed of his wife. And of all things, she's discussing with her husband her funeral arrangements. And she says, honey, if you're married, you understand this. Honey, I know you've never been able to tolerate my mother, but I want you to promise me that out of your love and devotion to me, that you'll at least ride with her in my funeral procession. And the husband, he thought for a minute and he said, well, honey, I'll do it, but I want you to know it's going to ruin my whole day. Well, that's probably what's going to happen here this morning, because I intend to talk about you're laughing, but you won't be. I hope to have you crying. That is, if I can keep you awake just for a minute or two, because what I want to do is just, first of all, tell you about how great it could be, how really great it could be, but why it can't be. This lecture, The Barriers to Freedom, is one I've started to give the past couple of years because it is, I think, the thing that's been haunting me from my youth. If this freedom thing is so great, and after listening to Opitz and all of us talking about it, I'm going to spend a little time here talking about it this morning too. If it's really so great, this idea of economic freedom, the free market economy, why ain't we got it? You know, if you look around in the world today, it's pretty pathetic. It really is. A third of the world's population at least is living under some form of totalitarian socialism. Another third, at least, is living under some form of authoritarianism. And I don't know but what we're living in some sort of an interventionist system rapidly moving in that direction. No one, to my knowledge, is living in a private property free market economy. Now, we talk about the free society in America today, but you've got to be kidding. If you believe that your government is in the business of protecting life and property, you must also believe in the tooth fairy. I mean, today to refer to the United States government as an institution created to preserve and protect life and property is about as ludicrous as you can get. Government doesn't exist in our society today to protect life and property. Today, government's in the business of plundering property and directing our lives. You don't go to Washington for justice. You go to Washington to get a piece of the action. You're looking for political largesse. We found a better way to get more in America than through work effort. It's through the political process. You don't go into business as a producer to make more money. You go to Washington, D.C. and get a job as a bureaucrat. Call yourself an economist, and you rip off your neighbor. We've got a book along with this called The Law. It was written by Frederick Bastiat in the middle of the 19th century, a Frenchman. He made an interesting observation. Thievery works unless everybody's a thief. As long as you have a few plundering the many, the aristocracy can survive for centuries. Feudalism is a very sound, secure system. Can last for a long time. It's based on the premise that a few will plunder the many for the benefit of the few. Now, we didn't like that system, so we got rid of it. What did we replace it with? Democracy. A system in which everybody is plundering everybody. You mean, to talk about, robbing Peter to pay Paul is absurd. We're all the victims and beneficiaries of this massive transfer society, this great rip-off society in which we live today. Truly believe in the fiction that everybody can live off of everybody else through the political process. There is, at least in New York, maybe not, of course not in Georgia, but at least in New York I know that there is something more sacred than motherhood and apple pie. It is the notion that somebody else should pay for the services rendered to you through the political process. Just to make the point, the other night I was filling out the automobile registration form for my car. I had to get out last year's registration form. I noticed that the automobile registration rate had virtually doubled. Not quite, but almost doubled the registration fee. And I was expressing this in a rather profane manner when my daughters said, "Why is it so much higher?" They didn't tell me to clean up my language. They've been trying that for years. They've just absolutely given up with their mother. They say it's impossible, it's a hopeless case. But at least maybe we can find out why this registration rate has doubled. I said, oh, it's very simple. The state legislature passed a law increasing automobile registration fees in the state of New York so that the resources could be used to hold down the cost of operating the subway system in New York City. It's going to mass transit so that the fare for riding on the subways in New York can be held at the subsidized level of last year. My oldest 16-year-old is turning into a radical. She says, that's ridiculous. I don't believe it. And I said, honey, we're just behind the looking glass, that's all. Welcome to Wonderland. This is the way the world works. You don't go to Albany to pass a law to protect your property or to adjudicate a dispute or achieve justice. That's in the textbooks. That's what Carson writes about in the American tradition back in the early days, that the function of government is to achieve justice. That beautiful universal concept that the equality before the law is something that you find in the textbooks, the old textbooks, I might add, not the new ones. Now, if you get an old enough textbook, they'll talk about government, the blindfolded goddess of justice. You know, the balancing scales. The blindfolded goddess of justice. Well, folks, the blindfolded goddess of justice in America today is peaking. Tell me who you are and I'll tell you how much you get. That's the function of law, not justice. What's the problem? What's the matter with the free market economy? What's the matter with the idea of a institutional structure to keep the peace, to protect life and property, to adjudicate disputes. What's wrong with the idea of being free? Well, let's take a look at what it is. You know, we've come down here, us Yankees. I'm sorry, that isn't the way you say it, is it? We came down here with a message. It's really quite simple. The message is the idea that individuals should be able to enjoy freedom of choice in the directing of their lives based on their respective values, whatever they are. Freedom of choice. That's what it's all about. Is there an absolute that we believe in? Yes, there is. The absolute is the notion that the individual should possess freedom of choice in the directing of his life as long as it's peaceful. Now that's a radical idea. This idea of individual freedom of choice. But that's basically what we are all about. Everything else kind of is subordinate to that notion. The idea of sovereign freedom of choice. Not in terms of, you know, the freedom that one possesses in a prison, psychological freedom. Freedom to do your thing as long as it's peaceful. Now, there's nothing new or revolutionary about it. It is radical, maybe. But it basically is the tenet of classical liberalism. This idea that the social order should be structured in such a way to maximize human liberty. That's what we're talking about. What's wrong with this? Everything. And that's what I want to get to eventually.